The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
So a donor to the campaign for the Republican candidate for governor in the state of Georgia was hired as a consultant earlier this year to oversee the elections in Randolph County, Georgia. Now, this consultant, who, again, is a donor to the campaign of Brian Kemp, who is the Republican candidate for governor in the state of Georgia, this consultant has just recommended that they close 7 polling locations in Randolph County, which is predominantly black. It's more than 60% black. Over 30% of the people living in that county live in poverty. And according to the ACLU, one of the polling places this official, Mike Malone, wants to close is 96.7% black. So let me restate this again, because a lot of people are talking about this story, but most people, I've only seen one person report that the man doing this, Mike Malone, who is a consultant brought in this year to run the elections in Randolph County, this man, Mike Malone, is a donor to the Republican candidate for governor. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, journalist Greg Bloomstein, who I have other issues with, but that's okay. He's done this reporting. Mike Malone donated $250 to the campaign of Brian Kemp. This guy has now recommended that 7 of 9 polling locations in Randolph County, Georgia, be closed. I'll play for you his explanation. I have the audio from the meeting that they had last Thursday. But again, can I reiterate for dramatic effect, because not many people are reporting on this detail? A donor to the Republican candidate for governor has recommended that 7 of 9 polling locations in a predominantly black Georgia county be closed before the 2018 gubernatorial race. It just so happens that the candidate for governor on the Democratic side of the aisle, Stacey Abrams, is African American. There's so many facets of this story that we have to get into, that we have to delve into. But first, let's take a listen to his justification, Mike Malone, his justification for shutting down 7 of 9 polling locations in a predominantly black Georgia county. Listen in.
Well, during the last 2 elections, I have visited every one of the precincts. I have met with the poll managers, the assistants, the clerks, and I have viewed the polling places. Folks, I will tell you right now, your polling places are not ADA compliant. Period. That's all I can say about it. Now, if you don't know what ADA compliance means, it's Americans with the Disabilities Act. You have to have compliant polling places. You're going to see during the presentation is out of the 9 polling places, 7 of them are not compliant.
So, because 7 locations in Randolph County, Georgia are not compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, instead of bringing them into compliance, this donor to Brian Kemp's campaign says we should just shut down 7 of those locations in a predominantly black county in Georgia, Southwest Georgia. I mean, there's really nothing else to say about it. You don't shut down polling locations because they aren't compliant. You make them compliant. And what Mike Malone is not mentioning here is the fact that these locations often are places like fire departments, fire stations. So they're not shutting down the entity, the fire station because it's not ADA compliant. They're shutting down the ability of majority black people to use that location to vote. And I wanted to play that, and I played so much, I may even play some more, because it is with such gall. He has so much gall to stand there and act as though he's so genuine about this problem. He's really concerned about Americans with disabilities. This goes back to one episode where I told you how they being conservatives, are using the language of the oppressed in order to continue oppression, particularly the language of civil rights in that previous podcast. But here, they're going to use Americans with disabilities as a means of disenfranchisement. And he's doing it with a smile. He's doing it with such a tone of authority and such a tone of concern, but authoritative, right? He's striking that balance. That's why he was hired as a consultant, because they knew that he could get in front of this population and say, yeah, we really have to be concerned about this Americans with Disabilities Act. But instead of remedying the problem, they're going to disenfranchise a county that's 60% black, 30% impoverished, which means that with this level of poverty, there are going to be many people who can't simply jump in a car and go to the next location. Why? Because in that type of poverty, you probably don't have a car. And if you do have a car, you're using that car to get to work. And can you get to work and still go vote on the other side of the county while taking care of all of your other obligations, picking up your kids after work? These are all the different little things that help to disenfranchise black voters. And this is a strategy. This has been a strategy of the Secretary of State of Georgia, who is now running for governor while holding his seat as Secretary of State. That's right. The man who's ultimately charged with certifying the elections is running for governor and has not relinquished his seat as Secretary of State, while one of his donors is attempting to disenfranchise a county at 60% that is 60% black. Brian Kemp, the Republican candidate for governor in the state of Georgia, has done multiple things to disenfranchise black people. Listen, let's dispense with this notion that somehow these people who want the support of Donald Trump, seek the support of Donald Trump, and get the support of Donald Trump are somehow going to be even-handed when it comes to critical issues like voting rights. That somehow we could look at them and say they are going to be the paragons of integrity. Yes, they're running for governor. Yes, they're playing games like Donald Trump. Yes, they are in the same exact league and column and category as Donald Trump. But we expect them to have the utmost integrity when it comes to the voting rights of African Americans. Especially when those voting rights, those African Americans voting, means that they could lose this election. Let's get into some specifics. Back in 2014, Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State, who's ultimately charged with the registration and the enfranchisement of every Georgia citizen, said this. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, he said, quote, registering all these minority voters that are out there and others that are sitting on the sidelines, if they can do that, they can win these elections in November. This was a statement Kemp made to Gwinnett County Republicans back in 2014. This reporting, according to Mark Neese. So you have to understand that this is the mindset and the framework through which Brian Kemp, the Republican candidate for governor, views the world. And he is in the position of authority and power as the Secretary of State to implement and act on those things, to implement his policies and his ideas of how to make sure these people don't get a chance to vote or register. He's in that position. And so now in this case in Randolph County, where 7 of 9 polling locations are about to be closed, Brian Kemp is acting as though he's against it. Well, it's super easy to act as though you're against it for the public when you have someone who is a donor to your campaign implementing it on your behalf. So that lets you know the mindset of Brian Kemp. According to that same article, quote, as piles of voter registration forms flooded election offices in 2014, Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp launched a fraud investigation into Stacey Abrams and her ambitious efforts to boost minority voter turnout. So this has been a long game for Brian Kemp. Ultimately, that investigation turned up nothing. So it ended up amounting to nothing more than a harassment of Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate, the black woman Democratic candidate for governor. So this idea that when these people hold these positions of power that are supposed to be nonpartisan in how they implement, they're supposed to be unbiased, right? It shows you that even though they claim to be unbiased, and this is not anything revelatory, this should just be obvious, that they're going to act in their own best interest, even if that means disenfranchising thousands of people across the state and millions of people across the nation. They will gladly disenfranchise you at the drop of a dime. Let's not forget the tens of thousands of people who were purged from the polls in Georgia, many of who were African American, just like in the state of Florida. Purging voters. Thousands, tens of thousands of voters. And in these races, in this hyper-partisan era, when races are becoming closer and closer and closer, the margin of victory is slimmer and slimmer, then it absolutely matters if you can disenfranchise 1,000 people, 500 people, 2 people. And they know this, and they understand if minorities vote, they are going to vote against the Republican Party. And notice the phrasing. I'm not saying that all minorities are going to run into the arms of the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party is so good. No. What I'm saying is that because the Republican Party is so atrocious in their approach to the African American community and the marginalized communities, the Hispanic and the immigrant community and the Muslim community and every community that's not white, Christian, and male, then the chances are if you are a minority and you're voting, you're going to vote against the Republican Party. Even if that means you really don't like the Democratic Party in many cases. And so instead of changing their approach to politics, instead of purging themselves of the white supremacists and white nationalists, instead of doing anything that actually benefits marginalized communities, what they do instead is shut down 7 of 9 of your polling locations. I've got a whole lot more to say about this. I want to dig into the Supreme Court decision that made this possible, as well as the response from the ACLU and several lawyers organizations here in Georgia, what they're going to do to fight back against it. Also, my recommendation of what we can do to fight back against it, to actually make them regret doing something like this. And I'll talk about all of that in a minute on the Patrons episode. But I mean, I think the most egregious thing here is the willingness of conservatives to look you in the eye and use something that was designed to help marginalized communities, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as a tool to harm other marginalized communities by disenfranchising a majority black county in Georgia. And to do so with a straight face, as though they're so concerned about this. And still, the most disgusting part about this is the fact that this man is a donor to the Republican candidate for governor. If anything remotely close to this had been on the opposite side of the political spectrum, if this guy had been a Democrat considering closing one location in a predominantly white district, county, then they would be raising hell. This is literally an attempt by a donor to help their preferred candidate win. And yet he stands there with the unmitigated gall to pretend as though he's doing it because he's concerned about Americans with disabilities. See, this is why we can't play games with these people. They are playing for keeps. They're doing everything within their power, anything imaginable, to disenfranchise voters so that they can ultimately just get political power. And when they are in political power, they create more barriers. They institute more purges of voters. They nominate judges who are going to make decisions like you saw in Shelby County versus Holder that ultimately made way for what's happening right now in Randolph County. So Republicans, when they get in power, they make structural changes to make sure that they never get out of power. And that comes at the expense of the disenfranchisement of millions of people across this country. And this is why we cannot afford to play games with them. We can't afford to play these games of false equivalencies. Oh, they're just the same as Democrats. You want to know the difference? The difference is once they get in power, they're looking for ways to make sure that you can never vote again to get them out of power or to hold them accountable. You can't even hold them accountable when your district is so gerrymandered that you as a Democrat or a progressive or a green voter or whatever you are in that county have absolutely no say because you can't hold them accountable electorally. And when that wasn't enough, when courts start overturning that, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side, now they're just going full-throated disenfranchisement. The structural changes that these people are making to this country are designed to keep us out of power and to keep us from holding them accountable. So what are we going to do about this? This is not something that's easily fixed, but this is a very tangible thing that we can act on. Lawyers are challenging this in court already. The ACLU, along with other organizations, they're challenging this in court. But the thing that you and I can do, in addition to making noise about this, is to help people get to the polls. I've organized several rallies, campaigns to get people to the polls, pushing people, taking 10 people to the poll, getting churches organized to get to the polls. So I'm going to talk to a couple of people around here in the state of Georgia, particularly here in Atlanta, where I have some relationships to see what we can do about ensuring that on election day, that if this goes through and thousands of people in this predominantly black county are not able to get to polls, we're going to make sure that there's transportation there, plenty of transportation there, to ensure that they can get to the polls. Now, lawyers are fighting this out in court. We'll see how this pans out. We have to fight this out in the court of public opinion. That's why we have to talk about it. We have to tweet about it. Most of all, we need to let people know that the man implementing this is a donor to the Republican candidate for governor. But ultimately, if those tactics do not succeed, then we do what we have to do and make sure that there's transportation for every single person who wants to vote, and encourage even more to vote, because in the face of this type of suppression of the vote, the masses should be willing to stand up even taller than they would in the absence of such suppression. Go to patreon.com/the BPD show for more.